James Holloway had been out of work for months when he stumbled upon a late-night security job at the Blackwood Industrial Complex. It wasn't ideal, but with bills piling up, he couldn't afford to be picky. The hiring process was quick, almost too quick. No background check, no real interview, just a handshake and a stern warning from his new boss, Mr. Grayson. "This job's simple. Stay in the guardroom, check the cameras, and patrol the halls once every hour," Grayson instructed. "But one rule: if you hear knocking on the door past midnight, no matter what, you do not open it." James had laughed. "What, is this place haunted or something?" Grayson didn't laugh. He only muttered, "Just follow the rule." That night, James settled into his shift. The guardroom was small, musty, and filled with outdated monitors displaying grainy footage of empty hallways, storage rooms, and the vast, abandoned factory floor. A half-eaten sandwich from the last guard still sat on the desk. The air felt heavy, oppressive, but James brushed it off as first-day nerves. The first few hours were uneventful. He followed the routine, watched the monitors, do a round, return. But something felt off. The cameras flickered occasionally, distorting the images. At 11:57 p.m., static washed over all the screens for a brief second before clearing up. James frowned but assumed it was just old equipment acting up. Then, at exactly 12:03 a.m., there was a knock on the guardroom door. James froze. A slow, deliberate knock. 3 beats. Then silence. His mind raced. Had Grayson set this up as a prank? Another employee testing him? He checked the cameras. The hallway outside the door was empty. Another knock. 3 steady taps. James's mouth went dry. He leaned forward and turned the volume up on the microphone feed outside the door. There was only silence. No breathing. No footsteps. Nothing. He sat still, heart hammering against his ribs, until the knocking finally stopped. The rest of the night passed in eerie stillness. The next night, James returned, determined to ignore whatever trick had been played on him. But at 12:03 a.m., the knocking came again. 3 slow beats. He checked the cameras. Nothing. His body tensed, fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Then, something changed. The door handle rattled. James shot up from his chair, stepping away from the door. His breath hitched as he watched the handle jiggle as if something was trying to get in. He backed up to the monitors. The hallway was empty, yet the handle twisted and turned as if an invisible force was testing it. Then it stopped. James barely slept the next day, his mind haunted by the unseen presence. On the 3rd night, he almost didn't come back. But he needed the money. The knock came as expected, but this time James didn't flinch. He ignored it. Then came the whispering. A low murmur seeped through the crack beneath the door. It was unintelligible, distant, yet insidious, like a voice slipping into his mind rather than his ears. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He watched the monitors. The cameras flickered, static washing over them again, but this time, something changed. One by one, the cameras shut off, except for one. The feed showed a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the factory floor. Too far to make out details, but James could feel its gaze drilling into him. Then it moved. It didn't walk. It shifted, a flickering blur, appearing closer with each camera jump. 1 second, it was at the far wall. The next, halfway across the factory floor. Then, outside the hallway leading to the guardroom. James's breath hitched. He turned toward the door just as a new sound came, a deep guttural scraping, like nails dragging across wood. The door groaned as if something heavy leaned against it. James did what any sane person would. He ran. The next morning, Grayson was waiting for him. "You lasted longer than most," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Most quit after the first night." James demanded answers. "What the hell is in there?" Grayson exhaled a long plume of smoke. "We don't know. Some say it's a lost soul. Others say it's something worse. Whatever it is, it's been here long before this factory." Then why keep this place open? James spat. Grayson sighed. Because it's bound here. As long as the door stays closed, it can't leave. James quit that morning. A month later, he heard on the news that Blackwood Industrial Complex had burned down. The fire started in the guardroom. The cause was unknown, but James knew. And he knew, too, that some doors should never be opened. The fluorescent hum of the overhead lights was a constant low thrum, a mechanical insect trapped in the sterile white of the hospital corridor. For Arthur Kendrick, it was the soundtrack to his solitude, the lullaby of his graveyard shift. He was the security guard, a spectral figure in a Navy uniform, a sentinel against the unseen horrors that lurked in the sterile after-hour silence of St. Augustine's General. Arthur wasn't a young man. His face, etched with the lines of late nights and quiet anxieties, reflected the harsh glow. He'd taken the job after a career in retail management, a desperate grasp at something steady, something predictable. He'd always been a solitary soul, comfortable in the quiet, but the quiet of St. Augustine's was different. It was a silence filled with the echoes of suffering, the whispers of the departed, the rustle of unseen things. Tonight, the silence was thick, almost tangible. He patrolled the deserted wings, his boots echoing on the polished linoleum, the sound bouncing back at him, a ghostly counterpoint. He checked the locked doors, the empty waiting rooms, the darkened operating theaters, each room a stage set for a play that would never be performed. He paused by the pediatric ward, the cheerful murals of cartoon animals now grotesque in the dim light. A chill, colder than the hospital's air conditioning, settled on his skin. He glanced down the hallway. Nothing. Just the shadows stretching and twisting, mimicking the shapes of his fears. Then, he heard it. A faint rhythmic tapping. Not the insistent drip of a leaky faucet, but a soft, almost delicate tapping, like tiny fingers drumming on glass. It was coming from the closed door of room 217, a room that, according to his clipboard, was supposed to be empty. He hesitated. He wasn't supposed to enter empty rooms. Protocol. But the tapping continued, insistent, growing slightly louder. He took a deep breath, the stale, antiseptic air filling his lungs, and gripped his flashlight tighter. "Security," he announced, his voice a low rumble in the echoing hallway. "Is anyone there?" The tapping stopped. He waited, his heart pounding against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. Nothing. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling slightly. It was locked. He pulled out his master key ring, the metal clinking softly in the silence. He found the key for 217, inserted it, and turned. The lock clicked, and he pushed the door open. The room was dark. He flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating a small, sterile space. The bed was empty, the sheets neatly tucked. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system. He scanned the room, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing. He checked the bathroom, the closet, even under the bed. Nothing. He was about to dismiss it as a trick of the imagination, a phantom sound born of the late hour and his own anxieties when he saw it. On the window, a small, pale handprint. He moved closer, his flashlight beam fixed on the handprint. It was small, childlike, the fingers delicate, the palm smooth. But it wasn't just a handprint. It was a smear, a smudge, as if the hand had been pressed against the glass, then dragged downwards. And there was something else, a faint, metallic scent, like blood. He recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. A child's handprint? In an empty room? With the faint scent of blood? He backed out of the room, locking the door behind him. He needed to report this. He needed to call someone. But who? The night supervisor? The police? As he turned to leave, he heard the tapping again. This time it was louder, more insistent, coming from inside the room. He froze, his blood turning to ice. The tapping grew faster, more frantic, like a desperate plea. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just walk away. He had to know what was happening. He unlocked the door again, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped the keys. He pushed the door open, his flashlight beam sweeping the room. The handprint was gone. He blinked, his eyes straining in the dim light. Had he imagined it? Was he losing his mind? Then, he saw it. A small figure huddled in the corner of the room near the window. It was a child, a girl, no older than 7 or 8, her face pale, her eyes wide and terrified. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't answer. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with an unearthly terror. He took a step closer. "What's your name?" The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out. He took another step. "Can you hear me?" Suddenly the girl's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his. Her mouth opened, and a sound erupted from her throat, a guttural, inhuman scream that echoed through the empty hallway. He stumbled back, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. The girl's face was contorted in a mask of pure terror, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And then, she vanished. He blinked, his eyes wide with disbelief. One moment she was there, the next, she was gone. He scanned the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. He was alone. He backed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, locking it with trembling hands. He ran, his boots pounding on the linoleum, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop running until he reached the security office, his sanctuary, his fortress. He slammed the door shut, locking it behind him, and collapsed into his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at the monitor screens, the images of the empty hallways and rooms flickering before his eyes. He needed to calm down. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what he had just seen. He reviewed the security footage from the hallway outside room 217. Nothing. Just an empty hallway. He checked the records. No child had been admitted to the hospital in the last 24 hours. He was losing his mind. He had to be. He tried to focus on his duties, to push the image of the terrified girl from his mind. But it was no use. Her face was etched into his memory, her scream echoing in his ears. He decided to patrol the other side of the hospital, to put some distance between himself and room 217. He walked through the deserted emergency room, the empty waiting area, the silent X-ray department. He reached the morgue, a cold, sterile room at the end of a long corridor. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He didn't like this place. The air was thick with the smell of formaldehyde, the silence heavy with the weight of death. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the exit sign. He flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the rows of metal drawers. He walked down the rows, his flashlight beam dancing across the name tags. John Doe, Jane Doe, unidentified male, unidentified female. He reached the end of the row and turned to leave when he saw it. A drawer slightly ajar. He moved closer, his flashlight beam fixed on the drawer. He could see a pale hand protruding from the gap. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to know. But he had to. He reached for the drawer handle and pulled it open. Inside lay a small, pale body. A child. A girl. Her eyes were open, staring up at him wide and terrified. It was the girl from room 217. He recoiled, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. He stumbled back, his foot catching on something on the floor. He looked down. A pool of blood. He looked back at the girl's body. There was no blood on her. He looked back at the pool of blood. It was spreading, flowing towards him, like a dark, viscous river. He screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the empty morgue. He turned and ran, his boots pounding on the cold concrete floor.